The depot sits on the seaward edge of the Haleth Plateau, about 40 meters back from a cliff that drops 80 meters straight to the Verith Sea. When the wind runs in from the north, which it does about 200 days a year, the whole structure hums at a low frequency that you feel in your back teeth. I had grown so accustomed to that hum that silence woke me. I had lived there for 11 years. Before the depot, there was the survey. And before retirement, there were 35 years of cold moons and uninhabited rock shelves, and the peculiar company of a mapping instrument that never argued with you. A Form 9 correction, the tool you filed when what you found on the ground did not match what the chart said was there, was the closest thing I had to a philosophical position. If the ground and the chart disagreed, you corrected the chart. The ground did not care about your chart. The ground was what it was. My name is Edric Saul. I mapped blank spaces for a living. I was good at it. The depot had been decommissioned 9 years before I moved into it. The Compact Survey Administration had no further use for a monitoring station on Haleth 7 once the Verith Sea fisheries collapsed and the Coastal Survey Program was wound down. The structure was sound, prefabricated composite shell, 2 large workrooms, a kitchen galley, a narrow corridor of sleeping quarters, and a wide instrument bay that I had converted into a library and reading room. The bay windows faced north-northwest. On clear days, I could see 40 kilometers of cliff face, and the sea below was a dark particular green that I still think about when I am somewhere too warm. I held the residency on a legacy permit, which is a bureaucratic artifact of the survey's decommissioning process. It means that a former survey employee who has demonstrated continuous habitation of a decommissioned facility for a period exceeding 5 years may remain in occupancy until the facility is formally reclassified or demolished. Nobody had gotten around to reclassifying or demolishing Depot Haleth 7. Nobody had gotten around to much of anything with that stretch of coast, which is why I liked it. I was 63 years old. I grew a small kitchen garden in the wind shelter of the depot's eastern wall. I maintained the weather instruments out of habit. I read a great deal. I had what I needed. I want you to understand the quiet of that place before I tell you anything else. The kind of quiet that has texture to it. The wind's constant undertone. The sea sound rising on certain mornings until you could hear individual waves even from 40 meters back from the edge. And then the birdless stillness of the plateau interior on cold afternoons when the wind dropped and the world held its breath. I had been a survey cartographer for 35 years, and I had spent most of that time in exactly this kind of quiet, on exactly this kind of terrain. And the honest truth is that I had come to prefer it to almost everything else. Not because I disliked people, because the rocks and the sea and the wind were straightforward about what they were, and most other things in my experience were not. She appeared on the morning of the 47th day of the autumn cycle, which is to say it was cold enough that I had started the heating coils, and cold enough that the sea mist did not burn off until nearly midday. I had gone to the seaward door, a heavy pressure door that I rarely used because the prevailing wind drove grit straight into the galley if you left. It opened too long to check on a weather buoy whose telemetry had gone intermittent. The door swings outward and opens onto a flat shelf of bare rock that runs to the cliff edge, and there are metal rings set into the rock for equipment tethering, because the wind off that coast, in the right season, can take you. She was sitting against the door, not at the door, against it, her back to the composite panel, her knees drawn up, her hands resting flat on the rock beside her hips. She was small, waist high if she stood, though she was not standing. Pale gold skin that looked almost painted in the flat coastal light, and wide eyes that were not any color I had a precise name for. Silver at rest, catching cold light and throwing something back that wasn't quite a reflection. Her ears came to a fine, upswept point. She wore what had once been a garment, a layered thing in ochre and pale green, and it was torn at one shoulder and stiff with salt. She was not crying. She was not frightened. Or she was not displaying fright in any register I knew how to read. She was simply there, looking at me with those silver eyes, the way a thing that has been walking a long time looks at a wall it has finally reached and decided to stop at. I said, "Hello." She said nothing. I looked behind her toward the cliff edge and then along the rock shelf to the north and the south. Nothing. The sea below was doing what the Verith Sea does in autumn, which is move with a heavy, self-important urgency and make noise about it. The mist was still thick to the north. Wherever she had come from, she had come alone, or alone enough. I said, "Come inside, then." She did. She stood up. She came roughly to my sternum, and she walked through the door ahead of me, which told me something, though I was not sure exactly what. A child that frightened does not walk ahead of you into an enclosed space. She walked with the particular deliberateness of a very tired person who has decided to trust one thing and is conserving everything else for later. I made tea. She sat at the galley table and watched me without moving much. I had been watched by stranger things in stranger circumstances. 41 species in 35 years. Several of them with sensory equipment I still don't entirely understand. But there was something specific about the quality of her attention. She was not observing me the way a nervous creature observes a threat. She was studying me the way a competent person studies a new problem, which is to say systematically, starting with what was most important and working outward from there. When I set the tea in front of her, she looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me, and then she picked it up with both hands and drank half of it in one movement. Her hands, I noticed, had a faint luminescence at the fingertips. Not bright, not the kind you'd notice in daylight. But in the galley's interior shadow, you could see it the way you can see phosphorescence in the sea when you break the surface at night. I had never seen that in any species I'd encountered on survey work. In 35 years, 41 species. I noted it the way a cartographer notes an unexpected feature, with interest and without alarm, and with the strong professional instinct to find out what it meant. I put bread and cold fish on the table. She ate the bread. She did not touch the fish. "All right," I said, "no fish." I got out dried pressed fruit, which she ate with concentration and without particular urgency, which meant she was hungry, but not desperately so, which meant she had eaten sometime in the last day or two. I sat across from her and drank my own tea, and did not ask her anything yet, because asking things at a person who has just come in from a cold night on a rock shelf seemed impolite when they had not finished eating. It is a rule I have kept since my first year on survey work. When I met a species that interpreted questions offered during eating as a form of territorial challenge, I no longer remember which species. I remember the principle. She was looking at the wall of charts. My library instrument bay was visible through the open galley door, and one wall was covered floor to ceiling in physical chart sheets. Paper. Real printed ink paper, the old kind that the survey stopped issuing 20 years ago when everything went to tablet display. I had kept mine. There was something about a physical chart that a screen never replicated, which was the fact that you could not edit it. It said what it said. Your corrections went on a new sheet. The old sheet remained. The permanence of what was recorded before, and the permanence of what superseded it, both in the record, both visible, neither one erased. She pointed at the charts. "Yes," I said. "Maps." She said a word. It was not a word in any language I spoke, but it had a definite shape, a single syllable with a rising terminal, the kind of sound that asks a question even when the phonemes don't correspond to anything you know. I have learned, in years of working on survey missions where half the team spoke different first languages, that there is a universal grammar to curiosity. It sounds like that syllable, like a held breath with a question mark at the end. "Maps," I said again. She said the word again exactly the same way. "I made them," I said. "I spent a very long time making them." She lowered her pointing hand and looked at me. I have been looked at by a great many eyes in a great many species over 35 years, and I have learned that what the eyes are doing and what the person is doing are not always the same thing. Her eyes were doing something I would call assessment. She was deciding something, slowly. With the same deliberateness she had used walking through the door, she said a different word. This one was softer, 2 syllables, a falling close. "I don't know what that means yet," I said, "but I'll learn." I did not know at that moment what she was or where she had come from. I did not know about the Vorath or about the Compact's resettlement order for the northern plateau, or about what that order had done to the encampments on the far side of the Helith Ridge. I knew a small being had appeared at my door in the cold, eaten my bread, and pointed at my charts. It was currently making a very careful decision about whether I was worth her trust. That was, it seemed to me, the relevant fact. I learned her name first. It took 3 days and some patience and a good deal of pointing at things and making sounds, and eventually I understood that she called herself something that had no equivalent in my language, but that her people rendered, when they wrote it down, as a series of marks that looked a little like a tide line. The boundary where 2 things meet. I called her tide mark in my head, but she eventually allowed me a closer approximation of the actual sound. Salith. I called her that. She corrected my pronunciation twice and then accepted it. In those first 3 days, I also learned that she had been walking for 4 days before. She found the depot, that she had eaten twice. What? I wasn't able to determine, and that she had slept once, briefly, in the lee of a rock outcropping on the coastal path. I learned this through the kind of patient arithmetic that you develop when you spend years, extracting information from terrain, correlating what she showed me about direction and pace and rest periods with what I knew about the distances between things on this part of the plateau. 4 days from the Helith Ridge, traveling the coastal path, meant she had come from the northern encampment sites, the old temporary habitation zones that the Compact had been quietly reclassifying as restricted development zones for about 2 years. The resettlement notices had gone out 8 months ago. I had heard about this in the abstract, the way you hear about most Compact administrative actions when you live on a decommissioned rock shelf at the edge of a dead fishery, as a faint, bureaucratic rumor carried by the supply shuttle operator, who was not well informed about anything but was enthusiastic about sharing what little he knew. I had not paid much attention to it because the resettlement was described in the supply shuttle operator's telling as affecting relocatable commercial interests, which did not seem to have much to do with me, or the 40 meters of rock between my door and the cliff edge. I had not paid much attention to the Vorath because I had not known they were there. They had not been there when I arrived, or they had been there in a way that left no visible mark on any chart I possessed, which should have told me something, but I was a cartographer by trade, and old habits are persistent. I trusted the chart until the ground proved me wrong. I filed an inquiry with the Compact Survey database, asking for the current species registry entry for the Vorath. The reply came back in 48 hours. No records found. Species designation Vorath not recognized. Please verify spelling or submit a new species registry application using Form 14B. I sat with that for a while. No records found meant one of 2 things. It meant the Vorath were genuinely outside the Compact Species Registry, which the Form 14B pathway suggested was at least a procedural possibility, or it meant the records existed somewhere and had not been indexed to the public-facing database, which happened more often than it should. Either way, Salith was not, in the eyes of the Compact's data infrastructure, a person. She was, at best, an unclassified biological entity, at worst, and I had been around long enough to know that bureaucratic structures produce worst cases with the same reliability that cliff faces produce wind. She was classified as an unregistered fauna specimen, which triggered the Species Identification Bureau's automatic quarantine and collection protocol. I had been a survey cartographer for 35 years. I had navigated the Compact's administrative infrastructure the way you navigate rough water, by understanding which currents would take you where, and by knowing where the rocks were. I did not like what I was looking at. Salith did not know about any of this. She was learning the names of things, which she did with a focused, Methodical pleasure that I recognized as the pleasure of someone to whom naming things is not trivial. She had a system. She would point at an object. I would say the word, and then she would go away and come back, sometimes hours later, and say the word to me while pointing at something else entirely, testing whether I had given her the object's particular name or its category. She caught me twice being imprecise. I corrected myself. She seemed satisfied with this. I taught her the word for map. I taught her the word for shore, for cliff, for the specific green of the sea in flat autumn light. I taught her the word for bread. She knew, already, the word for cold, though in her language it was a word that also meant persistent. The thing that stays regardless of whether you want it, too. I thought about that for a while when she told me. It seemed to me like a language that had been made by people who lived in cold places for a long time and had thought carefully about what cold means. On the seventh day, the first official communication arrived. It came via the depot's legacy data link, which still functioned because the compact's infrastructure maintenance arm had a standing contract to keep emergency communication nodes active on all decommissioned coastal facilities, and the node at Haleth 7 had never been formally delisted. The communication was from the Compact Species Identification Bureau, Coastal District Office, and it informed me, in the flat, precise language that bureaucracies use when they are not yet aware that you are going to be a problem, that a report of unclassified biological contact had been filed by a data monitoring algorithm that had flagged my new species registry inquiry and cross-referenced it with my habitation record and the recent resettlement activity on the northern plateau, and that pursuant to Section 41S of the Compact Biological Classification and Custody Act, I was required to maintain the unclassified biological entity in a safe and contained environment pending collection by a SIB field representative who would be dispatched within 14 standard days. I read this twice. I read the phrase unclassified biological entity 4 times. Because the more you read a phrase like that, the more clearly you understand what it does and does not mean. Then I read the specific language of Section 41S, which I had not read before but which I read now very carefully, the way you read anything you are about to argue with. Section 41E applied to biological entities that were not recognized under any current species registry and were not covered by any existing diplomatic protection agreement. It required temporary custodial holding of such entities pending classification. It used the word entities throughout. It did not use the word persons. It had been written, I suspected, for situations involving large mobile fauna on survey worlds, the kind of thing you might encounter on an uninhabited moon and need to photograph and contain before the survey team moved on. It had not been written for a child sitting at a galley table doing vocabulary exercises. Saleth was at the table. She had found a stylus in one of my blank chart sheets and was making marks on it. Not random marks, but marks that had a pattern, a tideline rhythm that I recognized as the kind of notation her language apparently used. She was making a chart. Saleth, I said. She looked up. How many of your people were in the encampment? She considered this. We had been working on number concepts and she was quicker at it than I had expected. She held up both hands twice and then 2 fingers on one hand. 22. Where did they go? She set the stylus down. She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at the charts on the wall. She pointed to the wall, to the specific charts. I had charts of the full Haleth Plateau system, and then she spread both hands flat, palms down, and moved them outward and away from each other. Slowly, the gesture you make when you describe something being dispersed, scattered. All right, I said. I sat down across from her. I'm going to explain what's happening. Some of it you'll understand and some you won't, but I'd rather tell you than not. She folded her hands on the table and waited the way a person waits when they have already guessed most of it. I told her about the SBIB notice. I told her what Section 41S meant in plain language, that they wanted to collect her and hold her somewhere while they decided what she was. I told her I was not going to let that happen. I told her this last part in the flattest voice I had, which is the voice I use when I mean something entirely and want no ambiguity about it. And she heard that register the way children hear that register, which is to say she heard it clearly. She said a word I didn't know yet. I asked her to repeat it. She did, and then she pointed to the depot walls, and then to herself, and then to me, and then to the depot walls again. I thought about this for a while. Yes, I said, this is the place. You stay here. I stay here. That's the shape of it. She picked up her stylus and went back to her chart. I went to work. Here is what I want to explain about a Form 9 correction, because the rest of this story turns on it, and it is not complicated, but it requires some background. In survey cartography, the official record of any mapped region is the master chart, the compact's authoritative geographic record for that area, compiled from survey data, maintained by the Survey Administration, and used by every agency in the compact for planning, permitting, resource allocation, and jurisdictional assignments. The master chart is not the ground. The master chart is what someone wrote down about the ground, and like everything anyone has ever written down, it can be wrong. A Form 9 correction is the instrument a survey cartographer files when they have physical evidence that the master chart is incorrect. It is a formal amendment to the official record. It requires the cartographer's credentials, a description of the discrepancy, the supporting evidence, and an amended entry. When processed, and there is a processing timeline of 72 hours for a standard Form 9 correction, because geographic errors have practical consequences and the Survey Administration built the processing time into its founding charter, the amendment becomes part of the official record. The old entry is not deleted. It is marked as superseded. The new entry stands. I had filed a great many Form 9 corrections in 35 years. I had never filed one about a person. Here is the thing nobody had bothered to make illegal. Nothing in the Form 9 correction protocol specified that the record being corrected had to be geographic. The form said official compact record. The species registry was an official compact record. The ESBS classification database was an official compact record. The resettlement documentation that had, somewhere in its processing chain, omitted the Vorath encampment from its affected persons manifest. That was an official compact record. I am a careful reader. I have always been a careful reader. Blank spaces on charts, in my experience, are not empty. They are places where nobody looked carefully enough. I sat down at my terminal and I began to read the official compact records on the Vorath relocation very carefully indeed. What I found took 2 days. I am not going to pretend it was quick. It was not. The compact's administrative records on the Northern Plateau resettlement were distributed across 4 separate databases that were technically under the jurisdiction of 3 different offices, none of which talked to the others with any fluency. The relocation office had processed the resettlement order. The Survey Administration had provided the geographic data that the relocation office used. The species registry maintained the affected persons' classifications. The SIB held the classification authority over any entity not on the species registry. 4 offices, 4 databases, 4 sets of records that had been compiled, cross-referenced, and somewhere in that cross-referencing had managed to produce a gap exactly the size of a Vorath encampment. The gap was not malicious. I want to be clear about this because it matters for understanding what I did about it. The gap was the product of an honest, unremarkable failure of interagency data sharing. The kind of failure that happens when 3 offices each assume one of the others has handled something and all 3 are wrong. The relocation office had asked the Survey Administration for the current habitation data on the Northern Plateau. The Survey Administration had provided data from the last completed survey, which was 11 years old. 11 years ago, the Vorath encampment had not yet established itself on the Northern Plateau. It had arrived 7 years ago, and, because the Vorath are not in the species registry, no automated system had flagged its arrival for any database update. The gap had simply been there, invisible, until a small child walked through it and appeared at my door. The gap was the error. The master chart was wrong. I was going to correct it. I filed 3 Form 9 corrections. The first corrected the Survey Administration's habitation record for the northern Halath Plateau, adding the Vorath encampment site as a documented habitation zone with supporting evidence drawn from the resettlement relocation records themselves, which had, ironically, generated a travel documentation trace for the encampment members that constituted ground truth evidence of habitation. The second corrected the relocation office's affected persons manifest for the resettlement order, adding the Vorath encampment as an omitted affected group and Saleth as a specific omitted individual. A person omitted from a manifest is still a person. The manifest's failure to record her did not change what she was. The third, and this was the one I took the most care with, corrected the SEB's classification database, amending its entry for the Vorath from no records found to a documented species with confirmed prior habitation of compact administered territory, and pending diplomatic recognition status, which is a classification that exists in the SIB's own protocol manual for exactly this kind of situation and which, when applied, suspends the Section 41 quarantine and collection authority pending the diplomatic review process. I attached supporting documentation to all 3. For the third one, I attached copies of the first 2, which had the effect of bootstrapping the corrections. Each one supported the others, and together they formed a closed set of ground truth amendments that, once processed, would be very difficult to unprocess, because to do so, you would have to explain why the ground truth evidence was wrong. And the ground truth evidence was the compact's own documentation. I sent them at 3 in the morning, which is when the automated processing systems run their overnight queue with no human staff to pause anything. Then I sat at my terminal for a while and read through the submissions one more time, checking for errors the way you check a completed chart before it goes into the permanent record. Methodically, without assuming you had gotten it right. I had gotten it right. I went to make tea and found Saleth awake at the galley table, her chart spread in front of her, working in the thin light of the overhead strip. She looked up when I came in. "It is very early," I said. She said the word for persistent, the one that also means cold. "Yes," I said. "I suppose it is." I made tea for both of us. We sat in the small, warm space of the galley while the wind did what the wind on that plateau always did, and the sea below did what the sea below always did, and she worked on her chart, and I sat with my tea and read a book and waited for 72 hours to pass. I want to tell you what those 72 hours were like because they were not all tension. That would be a tidy story, but it would not be an accurate one, and accuracy is the point of this whole account. On the first evening, Saleth showed me her chart and asked me, in our developing shared language, whether the coast on her chart was the same coast visible from the bay windows. I told her it was approximately correct, but that her scale was compressed along the southern section. She corrected it. She used the same method she used for rolling charts. Work from the center outward, fix the proportions from a known reference point. When she was finished, the chart was better than many I had seen from junior survey technicians in my first decade of work. I told her so. She accepted this without ceremony and went to work on the northern section. On the second morning, she asked about the weather instruments. I explained each one. She asked in particular about the barometric recorder, the device that keeps a running physical trace on a paper drum, the old mechanical kind I had kept because the digital weather system had a gap in its historical record, and the mechanical trace filled it. She understood immediately what the trace represented. A continuous record in the instrument's own hand, unchangeable, going back 12 years. She ran her fingers along the paper drum without touching the trace. She looked at me. She said a word I hadn't heard from her before, 2 syllables. One that meant something like before, and one that meant something like proof.
Before proof.
The trace of what already happened. I thought about that. "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." On the third morning, 73 hours after I sent the corrections, I checked the submission records. All 3 Form 9 corrections showed as processed and entered into the official record. I sat with this for a moment. Then I got up and checked the SIB's classification database through the public portal. Vorath, recognized non-compact species with confirmed prior habitation of compact administered territory, Haleth 7, Northern Plateau Zone. Classification status, pending diplomatic recognition. Section 41, authority suspended pending review. I went back to the galley. Sileth was eating breakfast. It worked, I said. She looked at me. She said the word for ready, the one that means the thing already decided and waiting for the moment to arrive. Not quite, I said. There's still the contractor. He arrived on the morning of day 11. His name was, according to his documentation, Peller Koth, and he was a licensed biological retrieval specialist operating under a subcontract from the Northern Plateau Resettlement Authority, which had engaged him to locate and return any unregistered biological entities found in the northern coastal zone that might have been displaced during the resettlement process. This is a sentence that means someone had hired a man to find the child. The Northern Plateau Resettlement Authority had done this not out of malice, but out of administrative nervousness. A displaced, unregistered biological entity in a compact administered zone was a paperwork liability, and the fastest way to resolve a paperwork liability is to have someone retrieve the liability and deliver it to the appropriate processing facility. The NPRIA had not thought very hard about what happened at the processing facility. They had only thought about reducing their liability. This is a very common failure mode in large administrative systems, and I have spent long enough around large administrative systems to have stopped being surprised by it, though I have not stopped being angry. Peller Koth arrived at the depot door, the landward door, which faces the plateau interior, at approximately 0700. He was medium height, compact, wearing the kind of field vest that has a great many pockets and is designed to communicate professional competence. He had a retrieval crate on a cargo trolley behind him. The crate was rated for biological cargo. It had ventilation slots. I looked at the ventilation slots for a moment. Then I looked at Koth. He knocked. I opened the door. He showed me his documentation and explained his purpose in the manner of a professional who has done this many times and finds the explanation slightly tedious. He was not unkind. He was simply executing a task. I have met a great many people who were simply executing a task. Some of them were the best people I ever encountered on survey work, and some of them were something else. And the difference was almost never the task itself. There's no biological entity here for you to collect, I said. He looked at his documentation. A Form 9 correction inquiry I've been flagged on suggests an unclassified entity has been present at this location. Was present, I said, in the SIB's old record, before the record was corrected. The current record reflects the accurate ground truth situation. He had a tablet. He looked at it, and I watched him find the SIB classification database, and I watched him find the Vorath entry, and I watched his expression change in the specific way that the expression of a methodical person changes when the documentation does not say what they expected it to say. Pending diplomatic recognition status, he read. That's correct. That wasn't there 3 days ago. No. 3 days ago, the database reflected an error. Now it reflects ground truth. I filed the corrections myself. My survey credentials are attached to the submission record, if you'd like to verify them. He was quiet for a moment. He was not a stupid man. He was looking at the documentation with the expression of someone who has just stepped onto what appeared to be solid ground and felt it give slightly underfoot, and who is now deciding how much further to move. I have a contract, he said. You have a contract to retrieve an unregistered biological entity, I said. There is no unregistered biological entity at this location. The individual in question is documented as a member of a recognized, if diplomatically unresolved species, and as a specific affected person in the corrected relocation office manifest. She is under this facility's custodial care, pending the diplomatic review process. Your contract covers an entity that no longer exists in the form that generated the contract. I'd recommend you speak with the Emperor about whether your retrieval scope still applies." He looked at his documentation again. He looked at me. He looked at the cargo trolley with the ventilated crate. I watched him complete a calculation. "I'll need to verify this with the CB field representative," he said. "The field representative is due today," I said. "I'll put tea on." He waited outside. I put tea on. The SIB field representative was a young woman named Assessor Jin Horel, and she arrived 40 minutes after Koth, and she spent the first 20 minutes of her visit reading my Form 9 corrections on her tablet with an expression that I have seen on the faces of junior compact officials before. The expression of someone who knows that what they're looking at is technically correct and personally inconvenient in equal measure. I had put Saelith in the library bay, not hidden. I had explained to her what was happening, in the rough, approximate language we had been building together for 11 days, and she had listened and then asked one question. The word for stay. I said yes. She went to the library bay and sat in the reading chair by the bay window with a chart sheet and her stylus, and the door was open. And if the assessor or the contractor walked in, they would see her plainly, which was the point. She was not hiding. She was here. The ground was what it was. Horel set her tablet down. "Mr. Saul, these corrections are procedurally valid." "Yes," I said. "The Form 9 correction protocol wasn't designed for species registry amendments." "The protocol specifies official compact records," I said. "It doesn't distinguish by record type. The species registry is an official compact record. I found an error. I corrected it. That's what the form is for." She looked at me for a moment. She had the look of someone doing a kind of moral arithmetic, totaling things up to see which side of a line they fell on. "You know what you've done is going to generate an administrative review." "I expect it will," I said. "I look forward to explaining my supporting evidence." She was quiet again. Koth had come inside at some point and was standing near the galley door with his tablet, still reading. "The pending diplomatic recognition status," Horel said. "Do you understand what that does to the Section 41 authority? Suspends it pending the diplomatic review process." "Yes. I read the protocol manual. The diplomatic review process takes months, sometimes years." "Yes. You're aware that the CB can challenge the Form 9 correction on the grounds that a survey cartographer lacks subject matter jurisdiction over species classification records." "They can challenge it," I said. "The challenge will go through the standard administrative appeal process. The processing timeline on the original corrections is 72 hours, and they have already elapsed. The corrections are in the record. A challenge creates a parallel record. It doesn't remove the original amendment. Until and unless the challenge is decided, the corrected record stands. I also want to point out that a challenge would require the S to explain why an entity with a documented habitation, record on compact administered territory, an assigned individual identifier in the relocation office's affected persons manifest, and a confirmed species with prior contact notation does not meet the threshold for pending diplomatic recognition status. I would enjoy reading that argument." Horel looked at me for a long time. "You're a retired survey cartographer," she said. 35 years, I said. "Living alone on a decommissioned depot." 11 years. She looked at her tablet. She looked at the open door to the library bay. From where she was sitting, she could see Aelith, the pale gold of her, and the silver of her eyes when she glanced up for a moment, and the faint luminescence at her fingertips catching the bay window light. Saelith did not look back at us for more than a moment. She returned to her chart. She was annotating the northern coastal section, working methodically from the center outward. Horel was not a hard person. I want to give her that. I have met truly hard bureaucrats in my life, and she was not one. She was a young official who had taken a job because she believed in orderly processes. And orderly processes are, in the abstract, not a bad thing to believe in. She was encountering a situation in which the orderly processes had produced a small being in a reading chair with a stylus and a chart sheet, and she was having to decide how she felt about that. The contractor's scope does not apply, she said eventually. Koth said nothing. He had been quiet for a while. Agreed, I said. I'm going to log this visit as a verification call. The record will show the corrections in place and the 41 authority suspended pending review. That's accurate, I said. Mr. Saul. She paused. The SIB is going to flag this file for administrative audit. The Form 9 correction use is irregular enough that someone is going to want to review your residency standing. I know, I said. Your residency here is on a legacy permit. Yes. Those permits are reviewable under Section 70E of the Habitation and Facilities Act when there is an active administrative matter involving the permit holder. I know that too, I said. She looked at me steadily. You knew they would review the permit when you filed. Yes. She was quiet. Outside, the north wind was doing its usual work against the depot's seaward face, and the hum in the walls was the hum I had lived with for 11 years. I had sat in that galley in winter cold and spring rain and the long, pale summer light of the plateau, and I knew every note of that hum. All right, she said. I'll log the visit. She and Koth left. I heard the transport lift off about 20 minutes later. I watched it from the library bay window, a small shape diminishing over the plateau interior until it was gone. Koth had taken the retrieval crate with the ventilation slots. I was glad to see the back of it. Salith looked up from her chart. Done, I said. She said the word that meant the space after something ends, not absence, the shape of what comes next. The administrative review took 6 weeks. I will not detail every exchange because most of it was correspondence, and correspondence is tedious to recount. But the shape of it was this. The SIBA challenged the Form 9 correction on jurisdictional grounds. I responded with 23 pages of documented evidence and a cross-referenced analysis of every Form 9 correction precedent in the survey's archived records going back to the survey administration's founding. The SAB's legal office spent 2 weeks reading this, and then wrote back to say that while they disputed the jurisdictional argument, the practical effect of the correction on the 41S authority was sufficiently unclear that they were referring the matter to the compact legal review board rather than pursuing further direct action. While this was happening, Salith and I worked on the shared language in the mornings and on separate work in the afternoons. She on her charts, which were growing more detailed and precise with each week, and I on the administrative correspondence, which required the same kind of careful precision and occasionally made me feel I was conducting 2 surveys simultaneously, one of the northern Haleth Plateau and one of the compact's regulatory terrain, looking for where the charts were wrong and correcting them. In the evenings, she sometimes came and stood beside me while I worked on the administrative correspondence and watched what I was doing. Not reading, over my shoulder, exactly, but present in the way a person is present when they are learning how something works by watching it done. I did not explain everything in those sessions because our language was still not precise enough for most of the legal nuances, but I explained the principle. I showed her a Form 9 correction on screen. I showed her the structure, the discrepancy, the evidence, the amendment, the ground truth against the chart. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said a word I had to ask her to define. She pointed to the form. Then she pointed to herself. Then she pointed to the chart on the wall. She was asking if the form was about her, the same way a chart was about the ground. Yes, I said, exactly that way. She looked at the form for a while. Then she nodded once, with the deliberateness she applied to most things, and went back to her own work. She never asked about it again. She had understood it well enough, I think, and understanding a thing well enough is a different condition from understanding it completely, and often more practical. She had taken to going out onto the rock shelf in the afternoons, weather permitting, and sitting near the cliff edge and looking at the sea. I had given her a tether ring in the first week after I found her there when the wind was running hard, and she had accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who understands that a tether is not a constraint, but a fact of the terrain. She knew what the wind off that coast was capable of. She had walked 4 days through it. From the library bay window, I could watch her, and I did. And I want to be honest about what I was doing when I watched her. I was making sure she was all right, and I was also learning something. The way she sat, still, facing into the wind, her hands on her knees, the luminescence at her fingertips faintly visible in the coastal light, had a quality of listening to it. She was doing with the wind and the sea what I did with blank spaces on a chart, attending to it carefully, without agenda, because the thing itself would tell you what it was if you let it. She taught me the Vorath word for cliff. It was the same word as the word for patience. I understood, I think for the first time, what kind of people they were. The Habitation and Facilities Authority also reviewed my legacy permit during these 6 weeks. They found that my 11-year residency record was unimpeachable. My maintenance of the facility's emergency communication equipment constituted a compact recognized public service, and there were no grounds to revoke the permit on an ongoing basis. They also found, however, that the presence of an additional occupant at the facility triggered a review of the permit's terms, which specified single occupancy residency, and that this review would require either a permit amendment or, if the amendment was denied, a relocation order. I applied for the permit amendment on the same day the review notification arrived. The permit amendment required proof that the additional occupant was a dependent. In the legal sense, a person in my formal custodial care. I filed the custodial registration, drawing on the relocation office's amended manifest, which listed Saleth as a documented individual without a recorded guardian or family unit. The custodial registration required a species classification. I cited the SIB's corrected database entry. The database entries supporting documentation included my Form 9 corrections, which were now officially part of the record. Each piece of documentation supported the next like a survey triangulation. 3 fixed points that defined the position of a fourth with precision. I had built this kind of thing for 35 years. I knew how to make it hold. The permit amendment review took 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Saleth taught herself to read Survey Compact Standard using my chart library and an old survey training manual I had kept. The training manual was 20 years old and, in Saleth's estimation, contained 7 significant errors. She flagged each one in her tideline notation in the margins. 2 were genuinely correct readings. The other 5 were her misreadings of technical conventions she had not yet encountered. When I showed her the relevant conventions, she accepted the correction without argument and went back to the manual. I noticed she did not remove her original annotations. She added a secondary notation beside each one, marking the error in her own earlier work alongside the correct reading. Before proof of a different kind, the record of where she had been wrong and what she had learned. On the 41st day of winter cycle, the permit amendment decision came through, denied. I read the denial once. The grounds were that the presence of a non-compact registered individual, even under the pending diplomatic recognition framework, could not be accommodated under a single occupancy legacy permit, which had been issued on the understanding that the facility would house 1 former survey employee and no other permanent occupants. The decision was not appealable within the Habitation and Facilities Authority's internal process. I could file an external appeal to the Compact District Court, which would take 12 to 18 months. I sat with this for about 10 minutes. I have been in the field long enough to know that there are 2 responses to a terrain obstacle. You can attempt to surmount it, which takes time and resources and is not always possible, or you can change your route. A change of route is not a defeat. It is a recognition that the map needs to be redrawn from a different starting point. I went to the library bay. Saleth was reading the survey training manual. Volume 2 now. She had finished Volume 1, and her chart sheet was beside her with new annotations. She looked up when I came in. "Saleth," I said, "we're going to have to leave." She looked at me, and then at the library bay, and then at the north-facing windows and the 40 kilometers of cliff face and the dark particular green of the sea below. She had spent 11 weeks here. She knew every room of the depot, every weather instrument, the precise note the hum in the walls made in a north wind versus a west wind, the best time of day to see the phosphorescence at the waveline when the autumn light was at the right angle. She had mapped it the way she mapped everything methodically, from the center outward. She set the stylus down, and she looked at me, and she said the word for persistent, the one that also means cold, the thing that stays regardless of whether you want it to. Yes, I said, I know. The denial was real. The cost was real. I had known it was possible when I filed, and I had filed anyway, which is not the same as not minding the loss. I minded it considerably. I had spent 11 years building a life in that particular silence, and I was not going to pretend that walking away from it was nothing. But minding it and changing course are different things. And a cartographer who refuses to revise the route when the route becomes impassable is not a good cartographer. He is just a person standing on the wrong side of an obstacle, arguing with the terrain. The terrain was the terrain. We would go. I had 1 month to vacate. The first 2 weeks I spent on logistics, a transit permit for Saleth, a housing application for 2 in the Survey Retirees Residential Facility on Vardith Station, and a notification to the Compact Legal Review Board that my contact address would be changing so that the ongoing Form 9 correction proceedings could reach me. The transit permit required a species designation. I cited the SIBS corrected database entry. It processed in 72 hours. The last 2 weeks I spent packing the depot. I packed the chart library last. The paper charts, all of them, the old printed sheets that said what they said and could not be edited. I rolled into tubes and packed in the weather-resistant cases I had used to transport survey equipment on cold moons. Saleth helped me roll them. She had a method. She would roll from the center out, which produces a tighter, more even tube than rolling from the edge, and which I had not thought of in 35 years of chart rolling. I told her it was a better method. She accepted this without particular ceremony, which is how she accepted most things, as a fact recorded to be built upon. We worked in silence most of those 2 weeks, which was not uncomfortable. I have always worked well in silence, and she was, it turned out, a person who used silence the way her people used the word for cold, not as an absence, but as a thing with weight and presence and meaning. We moved through the rooms of the depot together, cataloging and packing, and there was something in the work that I did not have a word for in my language, and that she probably had a precise and beautiful word for in hers, and someday I would ask her what it was. On the last morning, I unlocked the seaward door and walked out onto the rock shelf. The wind was doing its usual work. The sea below was the particular dark green of late winter, heavy and unhurried, the color of a thing that has been here long before you arrived and will be here long after. I heard Saleth come out behind me. She stood beside me, her shoulder at roughly my elbow, and looked at the sea with the same attention she gave to everything. The silver-eyed, patient cartographer's attention. After a while, she said the word she had said when the assessor left. The word for the space after something ends, not absence, the shape of what comes next. Yes, I said. That she took my hand. Her fingers were warm, warmer than mine in the wind off the sea, and the faint luminescence at her fingertips was barely visible in the full winter. Light, but I could feel it, a kind of warmth that was not exactly warmth, something a little further along the spectrum, closer to the heat that comes off a chart you have just printed and is already drying into permanence. We stood there for a while and looked at the cliff face and the sea. Then we went inside. I locked the seaward door. I picked up the last case of rolled charts, and Saleth picked up the transit bag she had packed herself. Methodically, center first, and we walked through the depot together, through the workrooms and the galley and the library bay with its empty chart wall, and out the landward door into the flat winter light of the plateau. The transport was waiting. I set down the chart case and looked back at the depot one final time. Composite panel and weather instruments and the legacy communication node blinking its red standby light in the gray morning. 11 years of one particular silence. Salith was at the transport door. She looked back at me. She said the word for ready, the one that means the thing already decided and waiting for the moment to arrive. I picked up the chart case. I walked to the transport. On Vardith Station, 6 weeks later, the Compact Legal Review Board ruled that the Form 9 correction protocol had been applied outside its conventional scope, but within its written authority, that the corrections were procedurally valid and would stand, and that the SIB's challenge was rejected. The Vorath were formally listed as a recognized non-Campac species with prior territorial presence on Haleth 7 and pending diplomatic contact status. The SEB's 41 authority over any Vorath individual was suspended indefinitely pending that contact. I received the ruling at breakfast. I read it once. Salith was across the table, annotating a survey training manual. Volume 3 now. She had flagged 4 more inaccuracies since Volume 2. All 4 were legitimate this time. I had been writing up her corrections for submission to the Survey Administration. Because if a thing is accurate and the record does not reflect it, the record should be corrected. The Survey Administration would have to either confirm the errors or dispute them, and I was fairly confident about which one it would be. I told her what the ruling said, in our language, the one we had built together over 4 months now, the one with no clean name, but which worked well enough for most things and was getting more precise every week, the way any good map gets more precise the longer you spend on the ground. She listened. She looked at the ruling document on my tablet for a moment. She said the word for the space after something ends. Yes, I said. She picked up her stylus and went back to the inaccuracies. I made tea. Outside the station window there was no sea and no cliff face and no wind, with a particular hum. There was the station's docking ring and the dark of ordinary space and a transit lane busy with freighters and supply, shuttles and the ordinary movement of a compact hub that has never heard of Haleth 7 or its decommissioned depot or the particular dark green of its winter sea. But the record had been corrected, and corrections in my experience are permanent. Everybody seemed to think I had done something remarkable. I had not. I had done what any competent cartographer does when the map and the ground disagree. The ground was what it was. I had simply written it down.